If Flaxby St Martin could boast of anything, and its residents believed it could boast of many things, though no visitor had ever quite agreed, it was the annual Civic Lantern Parade. Conceived originally as a solemn commemoration of the town's late Victorian adoption of municipal street lighting, it had over the decades softened into a modest autumn stroll involving paper lanterns, warm cider, and a brass band whose members appeared increasingly uncertain about which of them ought to be leading. Even so, the townsfolk turned up in impressive numbers each year, eager to admire the historical society's most prized possession, the restored number 12 Paraffin Street lamp, a relic which enjoyed far more public affection than several serving councillors. This year's parade, falling on a damp and indecisive evening, opened with the ceremonial ignition of the lamp. The society had insisted on unveiling it before the procession began, which meant that most of the crowd had gathered in a vaguely expectant semicircle outside the municipal library. Rain freckled the newly polished glass panels, producing a sheen that made the lamp look far more dignified than the occasion strictly required. Miss Etheline Broderick, treasurer of the Historical Society and guardian of the lamp's restoration fund, stood nearest to it with poise bordering on proprietorial. She had arranged her hat at an angle suggesting she expected to be photographed at any moment, even though no photographer had been invited. The absence had not prevented her from lifting her chin with an air of solemn anticipation. A thin figure in a council-issue windbreaker shuffled forward, the chosen igniter, Mr. Twig, lamplighter only in theory, since the town had not required anyone to light lamps in earnest for half a century. His real job involved unlocking park gates and replacing dog waste bags. Nevertheless, he approached the lamp with the same reverence he might have shown a sleeping tiger. A hush rippled through the crowd. The brass band, misunderstanding this as a cue, stopped mid-bar and stared expectantly. Twig struck the ceremonial match. It flared, wobbled, and sank into the lamp's chamber with a faint hiss. For a second, everything behaved as it should. A soft bloom of yellow light rose through the glass, steady and warm. Miss Broderick's expression shifted imperceptibly toward triumph. Then the lamp gave an unexpected cough, or as close to one as an object of metal and glass can approximate. The flame quivered, withdrew, then spurted upward in a brief plume of blue before collapsing into darkness with a sound like a damp candle meeting a draught. A thin coil of oily smoke seeped from the top vent. The crowd, conditioned to polite disappointment, emitted a gentle murmur. Someone near the back whispered, "Well, that's a shame," as though commenting on a dropped sandwich. Miss Broderick, however, stared at the lamp with the horror of someone observing a family member commit a public indiscretion. She made a small, strangled noise. "It should not have done that," she declared, her voice vibrating with outrage. "It was in perfect working order just this afternoon." Twig stepped back from the lamp, hands raised in the universal gesture of a man pleading innocence before judgment had been passed. "I didn't touch anything I wasn't meant to, miss," he said. "I just lit it, same as last year." Inspector Purbright, who had been persuaded to attend the event out of what he believed to be civic duty, but might more accurately be called polite coercion, watched the mild commotion with detached interest. He stood a little apart from the main gathering, coat collar turned up against the drizzle. The failure of the lamp did not strike him as a matter requiring immediate police involvement. Flaxby had endured greater disappointments, some of which had even been planned. Nevertheless, there was an unmistakable tension surfacing among several members of the Historical Society. The chairman, Mr. Earnshaw, an elderly gentleman of tired dignity, hurried forward, his expression pained. He peered into the chamber with the exaggerated scrutiny of a man hoping to diagnose a mechanical problem by frowning at it. "It could be the wick," he ventured. "It is not the wick," Miss Broderick snapped. "It might have loosened." "It did not loosen," she insisted, then added with the air of one obliged to share unpleasant news. "Someone has interfered with it." This declaration stirred the gathering more effectively than the lamp's puff of smoke had done. Several townsfolk in the front row turned to one another in speculative excitement. A few glanced at Twig, who looked as though he wished to be anywhere but within Miss Broderick's line of sight. Purbright approached with the unhurried tread that often made people confess things they had not done. He inspected the lamp's glass panels, then the chamber, leaning slightly to avoid triggering another plume of smoke. "What seems to be the difficulty?" he asked in the tone of one inviting a lecture he intended to endure patiently. Miss Broderick seized upon the opportunity. "Inspector, the inner brasswick holder, the original one, has been replaced." She pronounced the final word with the emphasis of a surgeon announcing the discovery of a foreign object in a vital organ. "Replaced?" Earnshaw echoed, blinking rapidly. "With what?" Miss Broderick reached into the chamber, retrieved a sooty metal piece with gloved fingers, and held it up accusingly. "This," she said, "a cheap steel fitting from a modern lantern. Utterly unsuitable." There was a ripple of disapproving murmurs. In Flaxby, replacing an antique component with a modern one ranked somewhere between stealing hymn books and parking on the vicar's lawn. Purbright accepted the fitting and examined it without comment. Twig shifted his weight from foot to foot, his discomfort radiating like heat from a stove. "They didn't touch any fittings," Twig repeated feebly. "Someone must have got to it before me." Miss Broderick gave a sharp sniff. Quite." Purbright returned the piece to her. "Has anyone else had access to the lamp in recent days?" The chairman and Miss Broderick exchanged a look of complicated reluctance, the kind that suggested a truth both inconvenient and potentially embarrassing. "Well," Earnshaw said slowly, "the lamp was stored in the Society's workshop until yesterday. Several of us assisted with its preparation." "Is supervised," Miss Broderick interjected pointedly. Earnshaw sighed. "Yes, supervised." Purbright nodded, storing away the nuance. The rain thickened slightly, coating coats and hats in a glistening film. Behind them, the crowd began to drift, satisfied that the evening had produced at least one memorable moment. The brass band resumed playing, tentatively, and the first lanterns bobbed into motion as the procession reluctantly proceeded without its intended star. Purbright lingered a moment longer, watching Miss Broderick stare at the disgraced lamp with a mixture of fury and wounded pride. A simple mechanical failure might have explained the incident, but something in her agitation and in the uneasy glances exchanged among the Society's members suggested a deeper discomfort. Someone, he sensed, was already afraid of being blamed. And in Flaxby, fear of embarrassment often motivated behavior far stranger than crime. By the following morning, the lamp's humiliating collapse had passed through Flaxby St. Martin with the speed and accuracy of a migrating rumour, swift, colourful, and entirely unbothered by evidence. Those who had been present relayed the incident with the solemnity of eyewitnesses to a small but meaningful tragedy. Those who had not been present embellished with such generosity that by mid-morning the lamp had allegedly exploded twice, threatened 3 children, and very nearly injured a retired postmistress who had been standing, quite innocently, almost 50 yards away. At the bakery, where gossip rose even more reliably than the dough, Mrs. Kelling informed her early customers that the lamp had been sabotaged by some outsider element, though she could not specify what element nor why outsiders would take such interest in an antique street lamp. The explanation satisfied her audience nevertheless, for Flaxby had long maintained a suspicious view of anyone whose family name did not appear in parish records prior to 1920. In the hardware shop, Mr. Meacher offered a quite different theory. The lamp had been cursed by improper restoration methods, specifically those involving cheaper modern fittings. When pressed, he hinted, without stating outright, that the Historical Society had been cutting corners for years. "It looks nice on display," he muttered darkly while weighing out a packet of nails. "But inside, who knows what they've been doing?" His customer, who had no personal stake in the matter, but enjoyed Meacher's flair for insinuation, nodded eagerly. By lunchtime, 2 camps had formed. One believed the council was to blame, the other blamed the society. The latter camp was markedly larger, partly because the council had fewer friends, and partly because the Historical Society's members tended to be proud, precise people who rarely forgave an unpolished remark, let alone a public fiasco. At the police station, Sergeant Malley brought the matter to Purbright's attention with the unspoken hope that the inspector would declare it outside police concern, and thereby relieve both of them of the need to listen to Miss Broderick's inevitable follow-up visit. "Plenty of people talking about it," Malley reported, sliding a cup of tea across the desk. "No 2 stories match, mind you." "They seldom do," Purbright said, stirring his tea with the cautious air of a man negotiating terms with a doubtful beverage. "Who has the most convincing account?" Malley considered. "I'd say none of them." Mrs. Kellings got it that the lamp burst into flames in the shape of a horse. Mr. Meacher thinks the council's hiding a scandal. The vicar's wife says the whole thing's caused by moral decline, though she didn't specify whose. Purbright allowed himself a small smile. A decline in morality seems an ambitious culprit for such a modest incident. I agree, sir. Still, several residents claim they saw someone hanging around the lamp enclosure the night before. Purbright looked up. Do they describe the same person? Not remotely. Malley flipped open his notebook. One says it was a tall man in a hat. Another's certain it was a woman carrying a bag. Someone else insists it was a small shape, possibly a child, possibly a fox. And old Mr. Window claims he saw a shadow, definitely suspicious, which he says is proof enough of wrongdoing. Purbright nodded slowly. In Flaxby, shadows were often assigned motives they had never dreamed of. And what did the society have to say today? Miss Broderick was here at 8 sharp, Malley replied with the fatalistic tone of one describing a mild natural disaster. She wants us to treat the lamp's failure as a deliberate act. Sabotage, she calls it. Does she offer a suspect? Only anyone with no respect for heritage. Which, Malley added dryly, is a wide field. Purbright finished his tea, though the drink did not appear to reward the effort. Has anyone mentioned why such a person might feel moved to interfere with the lamp? No motive offered, except the vicar's wife suggested jealousy. She was vague on who might be jealous of whom. Purbright rose and collected his coat. Very well, I'll speak with a few of the more vocally aggrieved citizens. It may reveal more about their anxieties than about the lamp, but anxieties are rarely irrelevant. His first stop was the library lawn, where Mr. Earnshaw and 2 other members of the society were conducting what appeared to be a post-mortem examination of the disgraced lamp. It stood on its temporary plinth, dark and sullen, while the 3 men circled it with the reverence of mourners reluctant to leave the graveside. Inspector, Earnshaw greeted, offering a weary nod. We had hoped the rest of the town would give this matter a dignified silence, but it seems the opposite has occurred. A Flaxby seldom meets hope halfway, Purbright replied gently. Miss Broderick arrived moments later, brisk and bristling. Inspector, the town is awash with rumours. It is essential we establish the truth before more nonsense spreads. Purbright suspected the truth might actually encourage more nonsense, but he refrained from mentioning it. Instead, he asked, has anyone besides the society handled the lamp since its restoration? Earnshaw shifted. Only those assisting with its display. Myself, Miss Broderick, Mr. Lyle, and regrettably Councillor Dalby, who insisted on inspecting the brasswork personally. Miss Broderick's mouth compressed. He has no appreciation for antiques. He treats everything as though it were part of a budget report. But did Councillor Dalby comment on the lamp? Purbright asked. Earnshaw hesitated. He did express concern about costs. Several times. When the lamp was left in the workshop until yesterday? Yes, Miss Broderick confirmed. Locked, of course. We take security seriously. Purbright noted the emphasis. Security in Flaxby often meant a lock of theoretical usefulness and a great deal of righteous trust placed in it. As he walked back toward the station, the afternoon light thinning behind dull clouds, the flow of gossip seemed almost visible, threads running from doorways, shop counters, and bus stops, all tugging the story in conflicting directions. None of the versions aligned neatly, yet several shared an odd tension, a quiet embarrassment beneath their outrage, as though the lamp's failure had revealed some deeper vulnerability the town preferred not to acknowledge. To a casual observer, it might have seemed a trivial mishap. But Purbright sensed the faintest smell of panic, social panic, the worst kind, settling upon Flaxby St. Martin like a damp fog. Someone somewhere in the shuffle of wounded pride and whispered blame was worried. And worried people, in Purbright's long experience, tended to behave foolishly indeed. By mid-morning, Inspector Purbright had resolved to conduct the first of his discreet inquiries. Flaxby St. Martin, he noted, contained enough personalities and half-hidden grudges to rival the most convoluted of London wards, and yet no one seemed to consider that a lamp's failure might offer more amusement than scandal. He began with Miss Etheline Broderick, whose indignation had scarcely abated since the parade, and whose eyes still glinted with the faintly terrifying precision of someone accustomed to accounting ledgers and moral judgment in equal measure. She met him at the Historical Society's temporary office, a narrow room crowded with restored objects, pamphlets, and a single pot of tea long since cold. Her hands, gloved for reasons unknown, clutched the misfitted brass fitting as if it were a small, combustible bomb. Purbright allowed her to speak at length, interjecting only to nod or murmur politely. She outlined in meticulous detail the lamp's provenance, the exact dimensions of its original wick holder, and the grievous insult of finding a modern steel replacement. "It is almost as though someone sought to humiliate the society," she concluded, her tone high and tinged with wounded pride. Purbright noted the careful avoidance of any name or hint of suspicion, a tactic likely designed to maintain civility while conveying alarm. It was a familiar pattern. In Flaxby one rarely accused directly, yet insinuations carried more weight than accusations elsewhere. Next, he visited Mr. Twig at his modest flat above the municipal storehouse. Twig, perpetually uneasy in the presence of authority, recounted his own actions with earnestness bordering on desperation. He had struck the match, waited for the lamp to ignite, and observed its brief flourish before the dramatic collapse. "I didn't touch the inner part, sir," he insisted, hands wringing. Purbright listened quietly, noting inconsistencies that were less in the factual content than in the delivery. Twig's repeated insistence on innocence and the unprompted declaration that he had never entered the workshop alone, for instance, suggested anxiety more than guilt. It was a subtle distinction, one that might elude a less patient observer. The inspector's route then led him to Councillor Dalby, who met him in the damp chill of the library forecourt. Dalby's concern was, as expected, financial and procedural. He emphasized his lack of physical interaction with the lamp while reiterating, several times, the prudence of budgeting for ongoing maintenance. Purbright detected a curious hesitation when Dalby referred to the previous evening's inspection, a pause that, while slight, suggested the councillor had noticed something he deemed inappropriate to mention. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet it drew Purbright's attention. Behavioral clues, he reminded himself, often proved more revealing than the physical ones, especially in a town where reputations were treated with religious devotion. At the vicarage, tea was offered with predictable civility. Mrs. Upcott, the vicar's wife, spoke of the lamp's failure in tones that oscillated between moral concern and understated glee. She implied that public display of pride often led to misfortune, a sentiment not quite a theory of sabotage, yet sufficiently ominous to unsettle an attentive listener. Her husband, meanwhile, offered procedural advice. The lamp's chamber should have been sealed with a particular wax, but this step, he allowed cautiously, might have been overlooked. Purbright filed the remark carefully, noting that it neither accused nor absolved, but provided a framework for later comparison. Throughout the day, the inspector observed the interplay of statements, the silences between words, and the inconsistencies in what each person deemed relevant. At the society office, he compared Twig's account with Miss Broderick's and found that both omitted mention of a minor detail. The lamp's storage had been briefly shared with an unaffiliated visitor, Mr. Lyle, during a hurried inspection. Each party mentioned him in passing, yet neither emphasized his actions. Purbright made a mental note. The omission was as telling as any explicit accusation. In Flaxby, those who felt guilty often spoke least, while those anxious to maintain decorum sometimes overcompensated with florid explanations. By late afternoon, Purbright had begun to perceive the faint outlines of motive, though not yet the person. Small irritations, rivalries, and civic pride intersected around the lamp like invisible threads, their tensions amplified by the collective consciousness of the town. Every statement, every careful clarification, and every polite denial added a layer to a complex social lattice. To an outsider, the incident might have seemed trivial. To Purbright, it was revealing, for human behavior in such moments often betrayed truths far beyond the immediate object of concern. As dusk approached, he returned to the lamp, now resting in the society's care with the stolen dignity of a fallen celebrity. He examined the steel replacement once more, turning it gently between gloved fingers, noting its poor fit, the scratch marks, and the subtle variations in sheen. This was no accident, he decided. Someone had deliberately substituted it. Why? Not yet apparent. The answer, as always in Flaxby, would emerge slowly through patient observation, discreet questioning, and the careful attention to human nature rather than mechanical failure. The day had provided him with a framework, a lattice of small truths, contradictions, and guarded statements from which the narrative would gradually unfold. And while the lamp remained silent, its story was far from concluded. Purbright walked back through the town, noting the cautious glances of passers-by and the whispered speculation that had already begun to form fresh tendrils around him. Some recognized him and quickly averted their eyes. Others lingered, perhaps hoping he would intervene, perhaps merely curious. The inspector made no effort to engage beyond polite nods. Each observation, each small gesture, each avoidance or overemphasis would later be assessed, catalogued, and interpreted. In Flaxby, truth was seldom delivered openly. It preferred to hide beneath civility, beneath routine, and beneath the polite facades that its inhabitants maintained with painstaking care. By evening, Purbright returned to the station, aware that the lamp had cast its first real shadow, not upon the streets of Flaxby, but upon the minds of those who loved it. And in those shadows the outlines of human nature became clearer than any mechanical fault. By the following morning, the town had settled into a predictable pattern. Speculation regarding the lamp's untimely demise and the mysterious steel replacement circulated more vigorously than ever. In the public imagination, the most logical culprit was, unsurprisingly, Mr. Twig, the municipal lamplighter, whose hesitant fumblings at the parade had made him an obvious target. Several society members, emboldened by indignation, advanced the notion that only someone so intimately involved with the lamp could have committed such a deliberate or negligent. Twig, for his part, was increasingly aware that he had become the center of polite suspicion, a fact that filled him with both dread and bewilderment. Purbright observed the growing focus on Twig with quiet amusement. It was an expected pattern. In small towns, the first available suspect frequently bore the brunt of collective imagination. The inspector, however, knew better than to equate outward blame with inner guilt. Twig's obvious anxiety could indicate culpability, but it could equally signify relief at not being accused more directly, or frustration at the absurdity of the situation. Behavior, more than circumstance, would reveal the truth. Twig was summoned to the station under the pretext of routine questioning. He arrived pale, clutching his cap, and greeted the inspector with an almost exaggerated deference. "Inspector, I can assure you I had nothing to do with changing the fitting," he began, his voice wobbling despite repeated attempts at steadying it. Purbright inclined his head, allowing the statement to stand. He did not interrupt, permitting Twig to extend his case for innocence, a strategy that often encouraged slips or contradictions to emerge naturally. While Twig spoke, Purbright observed his mannerisms. The twitching of fingers, the quick glances at the doorway, the subtle avoidance of eye contact when mentioning certain society members. To an untrained observer, these gestures might have suggested guilt. To Purbright, they hinted at discomfort in the presence of scrutiny, a perfectly ordinary reaction for someone unwittingly caught in a web of civic expectation. Simultaneously, the Society's vice-chairman, Mr. Lyle, made his presence felt. Lyle had long nurtured a quiet rivalry with Miss Broderick, particularly regarding curatorial decisions, and he appeared to savor Twig's misfortune with barely concealed satisfaction. "Perhaps the lamplighter's inexperience shows," he remarked innocently during a council meeting the previous evening, though Purbright noted the subtle lilt of enjoyment beneath his words. It was not uncommon, he mused, for personal grievances to masquerade as civic concern, thereby ensnaring the unwary in a tangle of assumed malice. Purbright returned to the Historical Society's workshop, not with the aim of confronting anyone, but to review the lamp and its surroundings with the slow, deliberate attention that had served him so well in countless minor mysteries. The lamp itself remained perched on its plinth, soberly inconspicuous, yet somehow more insistent in its silent accusation than the clamour of gossip in the town's tea rooms. As he circled it, Purbright noted the scratches on the steel fitting once more. They were subtle, irregular, and decidedly human in origin, not the predictable marks of tools used haphazardly, nor the wear of repeated handling. But it was not the scratches alone that caught his attention. Something trivial, almost absurd, drew his gaze, a small fleck of blue paint on the underside of the brass chamber, the kind of paint that had no business being there. Its origin was imperceptible at first glance, but it suggested carelessness, a momentary lapse, or perhaps a secondary hand, entirely distinct from the primary act of replacement. He crouched to examine it closer, aware that the tiniest of details could illuminate the broader pattern. The fleck was easily overlooked, and most certainly would be, by anyone focused on the larger issue of sabotage or blame. Yet Purbright understood that such oddities rarely existed without context. They were fingerprints of human behavior, subtle yet telling, often revealing the most pedestrian motives hidden beneath the more conspicuous theatre of scandal. His thoughts wandered to Mr. Lyle, whose private rivalry with Miss Broderick might explain a hurried or surreptitious intervention, but he dismissed the notion for now, noting the colour of the paint did not match anything Lyle was known to possess. Nor did it correspond with Twig's rather uniform habits. The fleck was incongruous, a small foreign note in an otherwise disciplined symphony, and as such it intrigued him. While considering the anomaly, the door opened and Miss Broderick entered, her expression alternately expectant and apprehensive. She greeted Purbright with a nod that carried both civility and unspoken challenge. "Inspector," she said, "I hope you're not merely inspecting the lamp for the sake of idle curiosity. There is a matter of pride involved." "I assure you, Miss Broderick," Purbright replied, "my curiosity is entirely professional." He inclined his head toward the lamp. "Though I must confess, the lamp seems less concerned with pride than with attracting subtle attention." She looked at him quizzically. "Attention? From whom?" Purbright indicated the fleck of blue paint without rising. "A trivial, odd little detail," he said. "It may be irrelevant, it may not. Yet it suggests a hand, or perhaps a moment, that no one has thought worth mentioning." He watched her eyes narrow slightly, registering the micro-expression that betrayed her surprise and perhaps faint irritation at the intrusion of such minutiae into the grand narrative of disaster she had been managing since the lamp's collapse. For a long while they examined the lamp in companionable silence. Miss Broderick's fingers hovered near the chamber, but she refrained from touching, as if the lamp itself were a living entity whose indignities could not be compounded. Purbright's focus never wavered from the paint. The placement, the pattern, and the absence of other smears or marks suggested intent, or at least the lack of care that might have allowed an accident to go unnoticed. He considered the sequence of events during the parade, the people with access, and the fleeting interactions of the night before. Then a thought occurred to him, small and unassuming, like the detail itself. In Flaxby, a trivial mistake could carry disproportionate consequences. The town, obsessed with decorum, habit, and reputation, might interpret the lamp's failure and its misfit as proof of deliberate insult, when in fact a minor oversight or an incidental smudge could have triggered the cascade of anxiety and accusation. The fleck, minute and nearly laughable, was not trivial in its narrative potential. Purbright's eyes moved over the surrounding area. There were no footprints of unusual size, no signs of struggle, nothing in the room beyond the lamp to suggest overt tampering. Yet the paint fleck offered a connection, however tenuous, between the practical act of replacement and the social theatre that had erupted in response. The person responsible, he mused, had handled the lamp, had perhaps worked in haste or at least under distraction, and had left a subtle trace that spoke more clearly than words of who had acted and under what pressures. He leaned back and regarded Miss Broderick, who had resumed her post near the doorway. "Sometimes the smallest things," he said softly, "reveal more than the grandest gestures. A lamp does not fail in isolation, neither does a town's gossip. All are connected, however faintly, by human hand or error." "Dude!" Her eyes met his, unblinking. "And do you know who it was?" as she asked, though her voice was both hopeful and anxious. Purbright made no reply, merely straightened and made a small note in his pad. Truth was beginning to take shape in his mind, emerging from the lattice of minor details, behavioral cues, and what the town considered trivial yet telling. The fleck of blue paint, a seemingly inconsequential mark, would prove to be a guiding thread, one that would unravel the more visible yet misleading layers of accusation surrounding Twig and the society. As he left the workshop, the rain had ceased, leaving the town damp but brightened by a weak sun that struggled to break through low clouds. Purbright walked slowly toward the station, considering the next steps. That small odd little detail, the inconspicuous fleck of paint, had quietly shifted his attention. In a town as meticulous and polite as Flaxby, such details were often overlooked by all but the most patient observer, and Purbright, as always, was patient. By the time he reached the cobbled high street, the sounds of townsfolk going about their routines echoed softly. He allowed his mind to linger on the lamp, the steel fitting, and the small trace of colour left behind. It was almost absurdly insignificant, yet in Flaxby almost nothing remained insignificant for long. The lamp's failure, the town's gossip, and this trivial, odd little detail were converging toward a story that was only beginning to be understood, and Purbright felt, with the quiet satisfaction of someone already attuned to nuance, that he was the only person who truly perceived its shape. Over the next several days, Purbright's inquiries expanded beyond the immediate circle of the Historical Society and Mr. Twig. The lamp's failure, once considered a contained and almost ceremonial incident, had begun to radiate through the town, drawing in a wider constellation of characters whose interests, grievances, and minor ambitions intersected with the unfolding narrative in ways that were subtle yet telling. In Flaxby, small towns were rarely content to leave matters isolated. A single event could resonate in private parlours, shop corners, and garden fences, and the lamp had done exactly that. Purbright first called on Mr. Hargreaves, the town's antique dealer, who had previously been tangentially involved with the society through advisory work. Hargreaves, a man of precise habits and a meticulously polished moustache, expressed concern that the lamp's collapse reflected poorly on all associated with historic preservation. But in the course of describing his worries, he revealed that he had been aware of a slight misalignment in the lamp's structure during a brief handling the week before, a detail never previously shared. The inspector listened with polite interest, noting that Hargreaves's motive was rooted more in reputation than malice, yet the disclosure nonetheless extended the scope of inquiry. Simultaneously, the schoolteacher, Miss Trilling, supplied her own observations. She had walked past the lamp during the parade rehearsal and noticed a shadow she later described as out of place, hesitant, almost apologetic. Though she was uncertain whether the figure had been adult or child, male or female, her statement introduced an element previously unconsidered. A passerby who might have had no official reason to touch or inspect the lamp, yet whose presence coincided with minor disturbances in the immediate vicinity. At the post office, Purbright encountered Mr. Godfrey, whose reputation for keen, if occasionally intrusive, observation was well known. Godfrey reported that a local painter, responsible for minor restorations in the town hall, had recently borrowed brushes and pigment that corresponded to the blue fleck inside the lamp chamber. The information was fragmentary. He had merely noticed the pigments missing and assumed routine use, but it provided a thread connecting the trivial detail Purbright had already noted to an entirely new actor. By the afternoon, the inspector had spoken with at least half a dozen individuals who were peripherally connected to the lamp, each offering insights of varying credibility. The butcher mentioned that a stranger had asked questions about the parade route. The librarian observed that one of the apprentices had lingered near the lamp in the hours before the ceremony, and the innkeeper recalled overhearing a conversation about replacing parts just to see if anyone would notice. Each of these fragments, while minor in isolation, collectively broadened the field of potential interference. What Purbright noted above all was the interplay of social dynamics. Rivalries, minor resentments, and simple curiosity all converged in ways that might appear accidental to an outsider, but in fact revealed predictable patterns of human behavior. The society's meticulous pride, the council's concern for procedure, and the town's inherent fondness for embellishment combined to create a lattice of overlapping opportunities, any one of which could have permitted the lamp's misfitting. He observed that the more distant individuals, those without immediate responsibility, frequently offered information with a subtle flourish of detachment, never admitting investment, yet demonstrating a heightened awareness of the consequences. Flaxby's citizens had mastered the art of indirect disclosure, hinting, suggesting, and embellishing in equal measure. This required the inspector to weigh the reliability of statements not just on factual content, but on tone, timing, and the social consequences implied therein. By evening, Purbright found himself compiling a mental map of access and opportunity, The field of possible contributors now included those with direct contact, Twig, Miss Broderick, Mr. Lyle, alongside peripheral figures who might have been unwitting or incidental participants. Even minor grievances such as envy of influence or resentment of oversight were now considered potentially significant, for human behavior in Flaxby often found expression in subtle acts designed less to harm materially than to assert presence or influence. The inspector returned to the lamp in the workshop once more. It had been left untouched, the steel fitting gleaming dully under the soft light. Its misalignment no longer appeared a simple mechanical error. It was a node at the center of a network, the convergence point of social and practical pressures that extended far beyond the historical society. Purbright's attention shifted between the object and the human landscape surrounding it, noting patterns in conversation, fleeting gestures, and small admissions that hinted at tensions previously unnoticed. As dusk settled and the lamps along the high street flickered to life, Purbright considered the widening field with his characteristic patience. No single person could yet be identified as responsible, though many had motive, opportunity, or both. The trivial detail of the blue fleck, combined with Twig's hesitant involvement and the society's intense pride, suggested that the incident was neither simple nor isolated. Rather, it was embedded within a lattice of human foibles and minor ambitions that Purbright knew could be unraveled only through meticulous observation and the gentle prodding of social dynamics. Walking back toward the station, he allowed himself a faintly wry smile. The town believed it had moved past the lamp's failure, yet in truth the story had only begun to spread its roots. The wider field revealed complexity, subtle motives, and unvoiced intentions that ensured the resolution would not be easy. Flaxby had provided him with threads, seemingly inconsequential at first, but each capable of revealing connections that the residents themselves had overlooked. And in those threads, the quiet truth waited to emerge, hidden in plain sight like the steady glow of a lamp yet to be fully understood. It was barely a week after the lamp's initial failure that Flaxby St. Martin experienced its second, entirely unexpected, disturbance, one that shifted the subtle equilibrium Purbright had begun to map. Early one morning, the gardener at the town hall reported that the ceremonial clock in the main vestibule had been stopped overnight, its hands frozen at precisely 3:17 a.m. The incident, unlike the lamp's failure, bore a more overtly mischievous quality. The mechanism had been carefully tampered with, the casing slightly loosened, and a single small stone lodged beneath the minute wheel. Yet there were no fingerprints, no tools left behind, only the deliberate, almost playful interference with a piece of civic pride. The town naturally found the juxtaposition unnerving. One mechanical failure might be written off as mischance, two suggested intention. Rumour quickly attributed the act to Twig, still lingering in local memory as the lamplighter who had allegedly mishandled the first incident. Yet Purbright noted immediately the lack of motive. Twig had no reason to interfere with a clock he never managed. The shift, therefore, demanded a broader consideration of opportunity, personality, and the minor ambitions of those who moved in the town's quieter corridors. At the station, he summoned Mr. Godfrey, the perceptive post office observer who had earlier noted the missing pigments. Godfrey supplied a crucial, if indirect, lead. During his rounds, he had seen a figure entering the town hall at an unusual hour, carrying what looked like a small pouch. The figure had been careful, moving in shadows, yet observable enough to attract Godfrey's attention. While he could not identify the person, the action confirmed the second act was deliberate and secretive, a deliberate intrusion rather than accident. Purbright proceeded to the hall, examining the clock with methodical care. The stone beneath the wheel was smooth, almost polished, suggesting it had been selected rather than plucked at random. He inspected surrounding surfaces, noting a faint scuff on the varnished floorboards and a minor smear of ink near the ledger desk, as though the intruder had brushed past while carrying the item. These details were minor, but in Flaxby they were significant. They hinted at both intent and familiarity with the town hall's layout. The society's members were quick to speculate in the tea house later that day. Whispers suggested rivalry, petty vengeance, and even more elaborate conspiracies involving hidden wills and disputed authority over historic artifacts. Miss Broderick, predictably, expressed horror at the violation, noting that the clock's tampering diminished the dignity of the town. Lael, with barely concealed amusement, suggested the act might be an experiment in civility, a statement that, while jocular, carried the weight of knowing observation and prompted Purbright to file him under persons of interest once again. Meanwhile, Twig's own agitation had increased. Although innocent, he now feared that the town's collective imagination would assign him responsibility a second time, compounding his stress. Purbright observed his jitteriness, noting that it contrasted sharply with the careful, deliberate interference evidenced by the lodged stone. Here was a behavioral clue of great subtlety. Twig's nervousness indicated perception of blame, not culpability, and the mechanical subtleties of the clock's tampering suggested a hand both confident and precise. The second incident widened the lens of inquiry significantly. Individuals who had seemed marginal, such as the young painter with the blue pigments, or the vicar's assistant who frequently accessed the hall for records, now entered the field of potential involvement. Purbright understood that each new event acted as a filter. It eliminated those whose actions were clumsy or erratic while drawing attention to individuals whose habits combined opportunity, patience, and subtle manipulation. The town's initial convenient assumption about Twig, he noted dryly, was now rendered increasingly unlikely. By evening, the inspector returned to his desk, reviewing the town's patterns, the minor contradictions in witness statements, and the subtle behaviors that had emerged in the wake of both incidents. The lamp's misfitting, the blue fleck, and now the precise disruption of the clock all suggested a common thread. Someone who understood both the mechanisms and the social dynamics of Flaxby, someone whose interference was deliberate yet designed to remain nearly imperceptible, and whose motives were likely entwined with reputation, pride, or minor rivalry rather than overt malice. Purbright leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a faint smile. The second incident, though ostensibly unrelated, had clarified more than it confused. By widening the field, it had illuminated patterns that the first event alone could not reveal. The lamp had whispered its story. The clock had shouted it in quiet, deliberate tones. And now, with the lattice of opportunity, motive and subtle interference expanding before him, Purbright could begin to trace the faint, deliberate threads that would, in time, expose the hand behind both acts. That evening, after the town had settled into its habitual quiet, Purbright remained at his desk, lamp casting a subdued glow over his notes, sketches, and observations. The incidents of the past week, the misfitted lamp, the peculiar fleck of blue paint, and now the deliberate disruption of the town hall clock, revolved in his mind like planets around a central, unseen sun. Alone with his thoughts, he considered the human dimension of the events, the subtle interplay of pride, rivalry, and meticulous social choreography that governed life in Flaxby. He reflected first on Twig. The lamplighter's anxiety, previously interpreted by the town as guilt, was in truth the nervous response of an honest man caught within a pattern of communal suspicion. Twig's actions had been functional, predictable, and inconspicuous prior to the incidents, yet his visible discomfort now rendered him a convenient scapegoat for those eager to attribute malice where there was none. Purbright acknowledged with the faintest trace of wry amusement that the town's tendency to focus on the nearest target was as predictable as the lamplighter's evening rounds. Miss Broderick's pride and meticulous devotion to the historical society offered another layer of complexity. She had framed the lamp's misfitting as a moral affront, emphasizing etiquette and propriety above practical concern. Yet her minor, almost imperceptible signs of irritation at certain explanations suggested a personal stake, an attachment to authority, to the reputation of the society, and perhaps, though subtly, to her own sense of relevance. Purbright considered how such devotion might intersect with motive, not necessarily for harm, but to assert control, to enforce order, or to correct perceived slights. He turned his attention to Mr. Lyle, whose quiet amusement at others' discomfort hinted at satisfaction derived from social imbalance. Lyle's behavior, although polite in tone, revealed an appreciation for subtle disruption. He seemed to enjoy observing consequences without overt participation. Purbright noted that such dispositions often permitted indirect involvement, the act itself performed by proxy, with mischief realized through suggestion, distraction, or orchestration of circumstances. The trivial details, the blue fleck of paint, the lodged stone in the clock, demanded careful scrutiny. In isolation, each was meaningless. Together, they hinted at method, precision, and crucially, familiarity with both the objects and the people surrounding them. Purbright considered the likelihood of opportunity aligning with motive and subtle skill, noting that Flaxby, in its rigid civility, provided both cover and context for acts that would seem improbable elsewhere. A single human gesture could ripple through the social lattice, amplified by expectation, conjecture, and anxiety. Purbright pondered the rhythm of the town itself. Flaxby thrived on appearances, on decorum and reputation. Gossip and observation were as potent as any legal instrument, and minor slights could metastasize into perceived conspiracies. This insight shaped his understanding of the lamp incident. It was less about the object itself than about the collective psychology it illuminated. The lamp, the clock, the society, the lamplighter and peripheral actors were all nodes in a network of social expectation, their actions and reactions revealing latent tensions as much as overt intention. In these quiet reflections, he reconciled the trivial and the deliberate, the accidental and the intentional. Human behavior, particularly in small communities, was rarely linear. It was a lattice of impulses, loyalties, irritations, and performances. Purbright recognized that the resolution would not arrive through direct accusation or hasty confrontation, but through careful observation, judicious questioning, and patient attention to mannerisms and contradictions. The truth, he mused, often revealed itself in pauses, hesitations, and the inadvertent emphasis of what one least wished to disclose. By the time Purbright extinguished his lamp and rose from his chair, he felt the faint satisfaction of clarity emerging from the day's examination. The narrative was coalescing around subtle signals, human imperfections, and the interplay of opportunity and pride. The incidents had widened the field of inquiry, yet had also illuminated patterns that hinted at the character and method of the responsible party. The answer, he knew, was close, not visible in plain sight, but embedded in the minutiae of behavior, the delicate interplay of social forces, and the small telling imperfections left by deliberate human action. Walking to the window, he looked out at the cobbled streets, glistening faintly in the post-rain lamplight. Flaxby was quiet, almost imperceptibly alive, each inhabitant performing the rituals of civility, oblivious to the threads Purbright had begun to trace. He allowed himself a small, private smile. Patience, observation, and the careful weighing of human nature would reveal the culprit. In Flaxby, truth seldom demanded confrontation. It simply awaited the one who understood how to read between the lines. Purbright spent the following morning orchestrating a subtle experiment, the sort that relied not on confrontation, but on observation of the guilty under carefully controlled conditions. He invited the key members of the Historical Society to the workshop under the pretext of examining a routine maintenance plan for the lamp and other artifacts, careful to include Twig and Miss Broderick, as well as Mr. Leal, whose behavior in prior meetings had struck him as quietly suggestive. The gathering appeared ordinary, yet each element had been arranged to provoke the faintest reactions in those who bore secret involvement. As the group assembled, Purbright allowed the conversation to drift naturally toward the lamp, referencing its steel fitting, the original brass, and the minor wear caused by previous handling. He spoke in a tone of casual curiosity, observing the subtle reactions. Slight shifts in posture, hesitation before answering, involuntary glances exchanged among members. Each seated themselves with careful civility, their expressions polite but attentive, anticipating formal discussion, yet unaware of the precise direction it would take. Purbright began without preamble, allowing the lamp, resplendent yet quietly accusatory, to anchor the room's focus. He spoke first of the incidents themselves, recounting the lamp's misfitting and the curious fleck of blue paint, then the later interference with the clock. Each description was deliberately measured, factual, and devoid of commentary, leaving the room to absorb the events without defensive impulse. Oh. At first glance, Purbright said, these may appear isolated, a mechanical failure, a minor mark, and a later obstruction. Yet when observed together, a pattern emerges, subtle yet discernible to those attuned to human behavior and circumstance. He allowed a pause, then indicated the lamp's underside. Or consider the paint, a single fleck, unnoticed by most, yet placed with sufficient care to suggest inadvertent contact by a hand familiar with the object's intricacies. This alone would be trivial, except for the concurrent disruption of the clock, precise, deliberate, executed by someone comfortable moving unseen through the building at odd hours. Eyes shifted slightly. Twig looked at his hands as if weighing innocence against suspicion. Miss Broderick remained composed, though the slightest furrow in her brow betrayed her awareness of subtle implication. Lyle's gaze darted briefly toward Purbright, a flicker of unease passing almost imperceptibly. The person responsible, Purbright continued, was neither careless nor obvious in motive. They acted deliberately but with restraint, leaving behind only minimal traces. The paint, a stone, and the unguarded timing of action. Yet these minimal traces, when interpreted alongside the behavioral cues we have observed over the past week, point unmistakably to an individual both familiar with the objects and confident in the predictability of the town's reactions. He fixed his gaze on Mr. Lyle. Your enjoyment of subtle disorder, your access to both the lamp and the hall, and the minor expressions of amusement and discomfort observed during our recent discussion confirm what the evidence alone might not. Opportunity, capability, and inclination converge in your person. Lyle's expression shifted from bemusement to restrained acknowledgement. He made no verbal defense. The weight of small, carefully measured observations had revealed him conclusively. Purbright addressed the society at large, and no harm was intended beyond minor disruption. The acts were expressions of curiosity, amusement, and perhaps the assertion of capability. Yet in a town so sensitive to decorum, the consequences were amplified beyond expectation. Understanding the human context is as vital as noting the physical evidence. Miss Broderick exhaled softly, the tension easing from her shoulders, while Twig's shoulders relaxed in visible relief. The room's atmosphere shifted from anticipation to comprehension, each participant acknowledging the delicate lattice of human behavior that Purbright had patiently traced. Finally, Purbright concluded, his voice calm and measured. Flaxby is a town where subtlety often outweighs force. The lamp, the paint, the clock, they were never merely objects. They were instruments through which human impulses, pride, and curiosity expressed themselves. By observing behavior, noting discrepancies, and attending to trivial details, the truth emerges quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet inevitably. Lyle inclined his head, a faint, wry smile, acknowledging the sophistication of the deduction. The society absorbed the resolution with polite murmurs and careful civility, the tension dissipating into the familiar rhythm of routine. Purbright had revealed the truth without dramatics, linking each minor clue to motive, opportunity, and human inclination, leaving no element unaccounted for. The room settled into reflective silence, each person considering their role, the town's dynamics, and the delicate balance between curiosity and consequence. In Flaxby, decorum had been restored, the incidents contextualized, and the lesson of observation quietly imparted. Purbright, as ever, remained the patient observer, his satisfaction internal, his work nearly complete. In the days following Purbright's revelation, Flaxby settled back into its familiar rhythms, though subtle shifts lingered beneath the surface. The lamp, now carefully realigned and polished to a gleaming perfection, stood at the center of the Historical Society's display, its minor imperfection fully corrected, yet its presence a quiet reminder of the events that had passed. The clock in the town hall resumed its steady ticking, the lodged stone removed and mechanism realigned, and the hall's custodians treated each movement with slightly heightened attentiveness, a residual wariness tempered by civility. The town's citizens observed the return of order with characteristic discretion. Twig, relieved of suspicion, resumed his rounds with measured diligence, offering the occasional polite smile to those who had previously regarded him with mild suspicion. He remained conscious, however, of the subtle scrutiny lingering in small gestures and sideways glances, for Flaxby's memory of minor scandals was long and precise. Miss Broderick, her pride restored and yet tempered by reflection, conducted the society's affairs with renewed formality, occasionally glancing at the lamp with what seemed almost maternal vigilance, though without comment. Mr. Lyle's presence was understated, his enjoyment of subtle mischief now quietly reframed by the town's collective awareness of Purbright's perceptive observation. He resumed participation in civic affairs with calm politeness, offering wry remarks only when appropriate, aware that the social lattice had been read and noted by an observer capable of discerning both action and intent. The other members of the society carried on, conversations tinged with discreet amusement and tempered acknowledgement of the week's revelations. Purbright returned to his office, enveloped in the familiar hush of routine paperwork and correspondence. The incidents of the lamp and the clock, once sources of minor agitation, now formed part of a broader understanding of human behavior and small-town dynamics. Each note, each observation, and each seemingly trivial detail had been carefully considered, filed away, and understood within the lattice of social nuance that defined Flaxby. In the quiet evenings, as the lamplight outside cast soft pools along the cobbled streets, Purbright reflected on the value of patience, subtlety, and attentiveness. Crimes, even minor ones, were rarely acts of overt malice. They were expressions of curiosity, pride, and human imperfection. By observing rather than accusing, by noting behavior rather than relying solely on evidence, he had ensured resolution without drama, preserving civility while allowing truth to emerge naturally. The town, meanwhile, resumed its unhurried life. Markets opened punctually, shopkeepers exchanged greetings with customary warmth, and the rhythm of civic and social duties continued unbroken. Yet beneath the familiar patterns, each resident carried an awareness, however faint, that the ordinary world contained layers of subtle interaction, that human impulses could create disturbance in the most careful of communities, and that the quiet presence of an observant eye like Purbright's meant that even the smallest gestures could be traced to their source. Purbright, completing his daily review of the society's correspondence, finally leaned back satisfied. The lamp, the clock, the minor upheaval, all had been resolved with the discretion, patience, and understated clarity that the town itself demanded. Flaxby had returned to its calm, though richer now, with the quiet knowledge that human behavior, observed carefully, could reveal even the most delicate disturbances, and that civility and order were preserved not by force but by understanding.